Across the war-ravaged expanse of Europe, a symphony of sounds marked a profound shift. The resonant pealing of church bells, the celebratory crackle of rifles firing into the crisp spring air, and the unfurling of vibrant banners, each proclaiming a long-awaited day of liberation. For untold millions, this day represented the unequivocal end of 6 grueling years of total war, a period of unimaginable destruction and sacrifice that had scarred the continent. Yet, for a specific, often overlooked group of young German women, cloaked in the shadows of desolate German railway yards, this monumental day heralded something profoundly different, a destiny far removed from the joyous celebrations gripping the Allied nations. Their uniforms were not crisp and starched, but rather threadbare, tattered remnants of what had once been the proud Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Their sturdy military boots, once polished, were now cracked and worn, testament to countless miles trudged in desperate retreat. Their hair, matted and unwashed after weeks of grueling displacement and dwindling resources, hung limply, a stark visual representation of their collective ordeal. Many among them were barely past their adolescence, some not yet 20 years old, their youthful features still discernible beneath layers of grinding soot and the pervasive pallor of bone-deep fatigue. They were the essential yet largely unsung cogs in a colossal military machine. Secretaries diligently transcribing orders, typists clattering out communications, radio operators maintaining vital links, and nurses tending to the wounded. This machine had, with ruthless efficiency, consumed their homeland, only to ultimately collapse, leaving its human components stranded and vulnerable. Now, with the formidable power of the Third Reich utterly shattered and its grand ambitions reduced to dust, these women found themselves not being directed towards the familiar comfort of home, but instead herded into trains, bound for an uncertain future of captivity. The scene itself was oddly surreal, a tableau etched against the backdrop of a broken nation, long, somber lines of women, their figures swallowed by utilitarian gray-green skirts and jackets, each dragging battered suitcases that contained the last vestiges of their former lives. With heavy, resigned steps, they ascended into the dark, cavernous wooden boxcars, vehicles that, in another grim chapter of the war, had relentlessly transported troops to the front lines. Some, seeking solace in ancient ritual, clutched well-worn rosaries, their fingers white-knuckled against the smooth beads. Others held tightly to precious, if meager, ration tins, symbols of a scarcity that had defined their existence. Still others possessed nothing at all, their hands empty, mirroring the void that now stretched before them. A young woman, her voice barely a whisper, a tremor of fear lacing her Hamburg accent, confided in her companion, "The Americans will not spare us. They will make examples." The chilling premonition was not her own, but an echo of words she had overheard from a high-ranking Luftwaffe officer amidst the chaotic, desperate final moments of surrender. Beside her, a taller woman, her features etched with the grim resilience forged by years spent tirelessly manning anti-aircraft searchlights against the relentless drone of enemy bombers, remained silent. Her jaw, however, was set with almost a palpable rigidity, as if she were physically bracing herself for an inevitable unseen blow. They had been indoctrinated, repeatedly, relentlessly, by their propaganda machine. The Allied forces, and particularly the Americans, were not merely adversaries, but savage, inhuman wolves. Captivity, they had been assured, would be a descent into degradation, unimaginable cruelty, and perhaps even a fate far worse than death itself. The trains, old and creaking, rumbled ominously westward, their passage cutting through a desolate landscape that bore the deep, unhealing wounds of war. Charred towns, skeletal and silent, drifted past the grimy windows like mournful ghosts of a vibrant past. Churches stood decapitated, their steeples vanished, reaching shattered fingers towards a bleak sky. Bridges, once symbols of connection, lay twisted and broken, their metallic carcasses folded awkwardly into the murky rivers below. Skeletal factories, monuments to a vanished industrial might, still emitted faint, unsettling wisps of smoke, as if the embers of war refused to die completely. From embankments alongside the tracks, gaunt children, their faces thin as fragile paper, waved with a desperate, unnerving curiosity. At night, whenever the train shuddered to a halt in the desolate darkness, the women huddled instinctively against one another, seeking meager warmth from shared body heat, their ears straining to catch the rhythmic crunch of guards' boots outside their boxcar, and the occasional, unsettling crack of distant gunfire, a grim reminder that even in peace, violence still simmered. Amidst this profound uncertainty, one woman, Anna, a former secretary from the bustling heart of Munich, found a small, almost defiant act of self-preservation. She managed to retain a small diary, its pages a canvas for her fear and fleeting hopes. In its cramped script, under the flickering light of a borrowed match, she confided her deepest anxieties. "We are being taken far, none knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps I will be." The stark simplicity of her words underscored the profound terror and resignation that permeated their collective experience. The relentless journey reached its unexpected conclusion not in another desolate German internment camp, but amidst the clamorous, chaotic activity of occupied Allied ports. Bremen, the bustling docks of Le Havre, and the strategic port of Cherbourg. Here, towering ships, their masts adorned with the unfamiliar stars and stripes of American flags, awaited them like silent behemoth beasts. The women were disembarked and marched, a long, weary procession, toward the towering gangways. As they passed, American soldiers stood watch, their expressions a confusing mosaic that the women found impossible to decipher. Some gazes held a detached curiosity, others an unsettling indifference. The German women, having braced themselves for the expected barrage of snarls, vicious insults, and brutal blows, found themselves instead confronting a bewildering sense of order. There was paperwork, endless lines, and a meticulous system of counting, tagging, and dividing them into distinct groups. It felt less like the vengeful retribution they had anticipated, and more like a strange, almost bureaucratic process, a chillingly efficient administrative task. Still, as the massive ship's engines groaned to life, a deep, resonant vibration thrumming through the deck beneath their worn boots, and the familiar coastline of war-shattered Europe began to recede and shrink into an indistinct smudge on the horizon, a profound sense of dread settled deep into their bones. The vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic Ocean stretched wide and seemingly endless before them, a formidable barrier between their known world and the mysterious, distant land of America, a nation they had only ever known through the distorted lens of myth and vicious enemy caricature. What awaited them on that other, unknown shore? Once on board, the rigors of the journey intensified. Seasickness, a cruel additional torment, gripped many, leaving them weak and disoriented. They were housed in cramped steel holds, where bunks were stacked precariously high, and the air hung thick and heavy with the pungent odors of salt spray and diesel fuel, a constant assault on their senses. Food, however, was issued on trays, a sight that elicited gasps of profound disbelief. Pale, wholesome bread, generous slabs of real meat, and steaming mugs of coffee. For years, their diets had been a desperate struggle for survival, consisting of boiled cabbage stalks, the notoriously unpalatable ersatz bread, a grim concoction of sawdust and barley, and thin, watery soup ladled from rusted, dented cans. Some women hesitated, their minds poisoned by propaganda,
suspecting the food might be laced with poison. But for others, the primal urge of hunger, long suppressed, proved too powerful. They devoured the meal, tears streaming silently down their soot-streaked faces at the simple, forgotten taste of real bread. "They feed us like they feed themselves," whispered one, her voice a mixture of astonishment and profound bewilderment. They had not anticipated kindness. They had anticipated only brutal punishment. Yet here was a startlingly different reality, a civility that, paradoxically, unsettled them even more deeply than any cruelty might have. When at last the ships reached the shores of America, docking in the bustling harbors of New York, the historic port of Boston, and the vibrant city of New Orleans, the women gathered on deck. They clutched the cold metal rails, their eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and awe, gazing at the towering skylines that rose before them, miraculously untouched by bombs. The colossal Statue of Liberty loomed into view, a potent symbol of freedom and welcome, yet its irony was not lost on them, drawing no smiles from their weary faces. Crowds lined the piers, a mix of curious onlookers. Some jeered, their faces contorted with residual hatred. Others merely watched in silent observation. The German women were marched ashore under the watchful eyes of their guards, their worn boots echoing a hollow rhythm on the wooden planks of the gangways. The air here was subtly different, cleaner, imbued with a sense of freedom, salted by the vast ocean, but miraculously untainted by the acrid ash and smoke of war. For the first time, a profound realization began to dawn on some of them. How utterly and completely their world had collapsed. Germany was a shattered landscape of rubble and ghosts. America, by stark contrast, was intact, prosperous, vibrant, and alive. Buses and trains then carried them further inland, deep into the heart of the United States, to a network of sprawling camps specifically constructed across various states. Fort Oglethorpe, nestled in the rolling hills of Georgia, Camp Ruston in the humid, sprawling lands of Louisiana, and dozens of others scattered across the vast nation. The roads unfurled endlessly before their astonished eyes, flanked by emerald-green fields stretching to the horizon, and quaint towns where carefree children rode brightly colored bicycles down tree-lined streets, and houses gleamed with freshly painted white porches. To these women, whose last memories of Germany were their own beloved cities burning relentlessly under the relentless Allied bombs, the very sight of such untouched abundance and peaceful domesticity was almost incomprehensible. They exchanged hushed whispers. Was this truly the land of the monsters they told us about? Could this incredible abundance be real? The Reich had promised them glorious victory and an eternal empire, only to deliver utter ruin and starvation. The enemy they had been so meticulously taught to hate, it now seemed inhabited an entirely different universe altogether, a universe of peace and plenty. At the formidable gates of these American camps, a new bureaucratic process began. Their names were meticulously recorded, their meager possessions carefully catalogued, and their tattered German uniforms exchanged for plain, utilitarian work clothes. But even before they could truly settle into their new, bewildering existence, there was one more, crucial step. The guards, firm in their demeanor, but noticeably not brutal, directed them towards a nondescript building. Inside, a strange symphony of sounds greeted them, the insistent hiss of steam and the rhythmic drip of water. It was the delousing station, though the women, still disoriented, did not yet grasp its true purpose. Their hearts hammered in their chests, a frantic drumbeat of fear. This, they thought, must be it, the ultimate humiliation, ultimate degradation, the precise cruelty they had been relentlessly warned about.
In the long, shuffling line, hushed whispers circulated like a dangerous contagion. "This is where they will make us suffer." One woman, her knuckles white, clutched her battered suitcase to her chest as if it were a fragile shield against an unseen torment. Another, with quiet, desperate piety, crossed herself silently, invoking divine protection. The line moved with agonizing slowness, and as each woman finally entered the tiled room, her ingrained expectations collided violently with a startling new reality. They were handed bars of soap, real soap, thick, white, surprisingly heavy in their hands, emanating the faint, almost forgotten scent of flowers. Towels followed, soft and clean, then fresh civilian garments. The showers, surprisingly, released torrents of genuinely hot water, washing away not only months of accumulated grime and filth, but also, in a deeper sense, some of the psychological residue of war. Some women, overwhelmed by the simple, unexpected luxury, wept openly, the sound echoing off the sterile tiles. Others laughed nervously, a brittle sound, unable to fully comprehend or believe this unforeseen kindness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they felt truly clean. Their hair finally free of lice, their skin liberated from the pervasive layer of dirt and sweat. It was not the humiliation they had anticipated, but an act of profound, almost sacred restoration, and it shook them to their very core, rattling the foundations of their indoctrinated beliefs. Anna, in the quiet solitude of that night, took out her small diary once more. Her handwriting, usually neat and precise, trembled across the page as she confided her bewilderment. We were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, we were given soap. How can this be? She did not yet fully grasp the profound significance of this moment, this simple, cleansing act, but she sensed, deep within her, that it would be etched into her memory, perhaps even more vividly and enduringly than the harrowing years of the war itself. The women lay in their bunks that night, their hair still damp and cool from the showers, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly, wonderfully, of starch and fresh cotton. Outside, the foreign American night hummed with the steady, comforting chorus of crickets, a sound utterly devoid of the thunder of artillery or the distant drone of bombers. They began to whisper to one another, their voices hushed and low, but charged with an urgent shared understanding, as if they were sharing a secret too fragile, too subversive to be spoken aloud. Perhaps the enemy, the monstrous entity they had been so relentlessly told about, was not what they had been led to believe. Perhaps there was something here, in this strange land, that neither the relentless drumbeat of propaganda nor the cold grip of fear could adequately explain. What awaited them in the unfolding days, the provision of abundant food, the expectation of work, and the countless small, often bewildering encounters with their American captors, would continue to astonish and challenge their deeply ingrained perceptions even further. For now, however, one image lingered persistently in every mind, the tangible, palpable reality of the soap in their hands. It was slippery, fragrant, and absurdly gentle. It was only the beginning of their captivity, a new, unforeseen chapter in their lives. Yet in that unexpected gesture of humanity, it already felt like the beginning of something else entirely, a fragile seed of hope, or perhaps a profound reevaluation of everything they thought they knew. And as the pale dawn broke over the camp, casting a soft, uncertain light, a silent, weighty question settled among them like the morning mist. If the enemy could demonstrate such unexpected and disarming humanity, what other, even more profound surprises lay hidden in the days ahead?
The buses, their sturdy engines rumbling with a low, constant growl, rolled through the imposing gates crowned with glinting barbed wire. As they traversed the camp's dusty roads, pale clouds of dust billowed in their wake. For the women confined within, the sight was a jarring juxtaposition, simultaneously frightening in its implications of confinement, yet strangely orderly in its disciplined layout. Guard towers, sentinels of surveillance, stood at regular intervals, casting long shadows. Soldiers, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, lounged with a deceptive air of relaxation, their presence a constant reminder of authority. Rows of identical barracks stretched neatly across the expansive fields, a testament to planned efficiency. This, they gradually realized, was not the brutal, chaotic grayness of a concentration camp, the terrifying images etched into their collective consciousness. This was something bewilderingly, unsettlingly different. The wooden buildings, though utilitarian, were painted, not left to rot. The paths were swept clean, not littered with debris. The fences, while undeniably present and defining boundaries, were intact and purposeful, rather than menacing structures designed solely for torment. The prisoners exchanged furtive, silent glances, each face reflecting the same unspoken question: what strange new world have we truly stepped into? When they were finally filed off to bus, each woman was handed a small, numbered tag, a fresh symbol of their new identity as a prisoner. American officers moved with a clipped, almost mechanical efficiency, their pens scratching across official documents as they scribbled notes and stamped papers with decisive thuds. The women, conditioned by years of harsh military discipline, stiffened instinctively, bracing themselves for the anticipated barrage of insults or the barked commands that characterized their former lives. Yet, to their profound surprise, the guards spoke with a remarkable calmness. Their English tones softened either by the languid cadences of Southern drawls or the flat, uninflected rhythm of Midwestern accents. For many, the initial shock stemmed not from any anticipated cruelty, but from an almost disarming indifference. The Americans treated them not as monstrous enemies, nor even as welcomed guests, but as something strangely, pragmatically ordinary. Prisoners of war to be managed, meticulously catalogued, and adequately housed according to established protocols. The delousing station, with its unexpected civility, had already begun to chip away at their hardened expectations. But what followed was even stranger, more profoundly unsettling. After completing the cleansing ritual of the showers, they were led, a hesitant procession, into a large bustling mess hall. The long, cavernous room was immediately assailed by a potent blend of aromas: the robust scent of freshly brewed coffee, the warm, yeasty smell of baking bread, and the unmistakable, enticing sizzle of something frying in rich grease. The women froze in the doorway, momentarily disoriented by the sheer olfactory assault, a sensory overload after years of deprivation. Tables, long and unadorned, stretched across the hall, laden with an almost unbelievable array of food on trays. Soft, boiled potatoes, vibrant sweet carrots, thick, hearty beef stew, and fresh, soft rolls gleaming invitingly with butter. Steam rising from the hot food fogged the windows, blurring the outside world. The aroma, thick and overwhelming, was an assault of sheer abundance, a direct challenge to their ingrained memories of scarcity. One of the guards, with a simple, reassuring gesture, motioned them forward. Reluctantly, still hesitant and unsure, they stepped towards the serving counter. A cook, his white apron pristine against the backdrop of the bustling kitchen, dropped generous spoonfuls of stew onto tin plates, slid thick slices of bread across the counter, and filled mugs to the brim with steaming coffee. The women accepted the trays as though they were handling fragile explosives, their movements tentative and precise. Some, consumed by lingering suspicion, could not bring themselves to meet the cook's eye. Others simply stared at the food, a silent question in their gaze, unsure if this bounty could possibly be real or merely a cruel mirage. In Germany, during the brutal final winter of the war, meals had been reduced to an absolute minimum. Black bread, often adulterated with sawdust, thin, watery turnip soup, and perhaps, if one were extraordinarily lucky, a minuscule scrap of horse meat. Now, in the very camp of their sworn enemy, They were being given more in a single meal than they had collectively seen in weeks.
Anna, her precious diaries safely tucked away under her mattress, found a seat at one of the long tables with her brimming tray. She dipped her spoon into the rich stew, observing the glistening sheen of grease floating on top, the generous chunks of meat promising sustenance. Tentatively, she tasted it. Her eyes widened, a profound, almost childlike wonder replacing the habitual wariness, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if to stifle a gasp, or perhaps out of a deep-seated shame for experiencing such unexpected pleasure. Around her, other women, mirroring her initial hesitation, slowly began to eat, the only sounds breaking the profound silence being the soft scrape of cutlery against tin plates. For some, tears, hot and uncontrollable, slid down their cheeks, a raw emotional release. One woman, her voice choked with emotion, whispered, "My brothers starved in the snow, and here they feed us like this." It was not the promised kindness that their own leaders had repeatedly assured them was the sole domain of the victorious Reich, but rather a profound, almost incomprehensible act of basic human decency. And yet the promised humiliation, the taunts and jeering they had steeled themselves for, never materialized. The guards paced slowly, methodically, up and down the aisles, casting professional, detached glances at the eating women. One young soldier, barely older than the prisoners themselves, even offered a small, crooked smile as he passed, a quiet, almost shy gesture, as if to wordlessly reassure them. The prisoners, so thoroughly conditioned for cruelty, were utterly unprepared for such contradictions. This quiet civility, this unexpected lack of malice, was somehow more profoundly disturbing than any overt brutality might have been. It chipped away at their very understanding of the world. In the bewildering days that followed, the routines of camp life continued to reveal further shocks, each one a subtle but potent challenge to their ingrained beliefs. Each morning they were roused from their bunks by the clear, insistent peal of a bell, signaling the start of a new day. After a hearty breakfast, they were assigned various light duties, tasks designed to keep them occupied and contribute to the camp's functioning. Some were sent to work in the bustling kitchens, peeling vegetables and stirring vast pots. Others toiled in the verdant fields nearby, cultivating crops under the watchful but not oppressive eyes of their guards. Still others found themselves in the camp laundries, meticulously scrubbing and pressing American uniforms, the scent of starch and clean linen a constant presence. For these labors they were paid small wages, disbursed in camp scrip, a localized currency that could be exchanged for items at the canteen. There, on plain wooden shelves, lay an array of goods that, to them, seemed nothing short of miraculous. Bars of rich chocolate, packets of cigarettes, sharp pencils, and even tubes of vibrant lipstick. The women stood before these everyday commodities as though they were gazing upon a sacred altar, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and longing. A bar of chocolate, a common treat in America, felt like an absolute miracle, a forbidden luxury. A tube of lipstick, once a symbol of everyday femininity, was utterly unthinkable in their former lives. And yet here, in the camp of their sworn enemy, these goods were offered freely, in exchange for their labor. The irony, a bitter taste on their tongues, was almost cruel in its stark contrast to their recent past. Back in their shattered homeland of Germany, their families, those who had survived the relentless bombing and the harsh privations of war, scavenged desperately for scraps, mere vestiges of sustenance. Cities, once vibrant centers of culture and industry, lay in desolate ashes. Children, their bellies perpetually aching with hunger, picked through the rubble, their small fingers sifting for forgotten crusts of bread. Letters, painstakingly written and smuggled through unreliable censors, occasionally trickled in from home, if they arrived at all. Each one was a stark testament to despair. One woman, her voice trembling with emotion, read aloud by the flickering candlelight of the barracks. "We live in the cellar now, our house above utterly destroyed. We boil weeds for soup. If you have anything at all, send it." She folded the fragile paper with trembling fingers, the crushing weight of her helplessness palpable, knowing that she could send nothing back to her starving family but hollow words. The vast, unbridgeable gulf between their suffering homeland and the strange, unsettling abundance of the American camp widened with each passing day, becoming an almost unbearable chasm.
For some, this stark contrast began to manifest as a profound shame, a burden heavier and more oppressive than any physical chains. They were, after all, the enemy, soldiers of the defeated Reich. Yet here they were, inexplicably fed, clothed, and sheltered, their basic needs not only met, but generously exceeded. The Reich, the ideology they had been taught to pledge their absolute loyalty to, had demanded everything from them, sending them to man vital radios and operate crucial anti-aircraft searchlights, only to reward their devotion with gnawing hunger and the desolation of ruins. America, the very enemy they had been meticulously conditioned to hate with every fiber of their being, instead offered them simple, restorative soap and nourishing stew. This profound inversion of expectations, this bewildering reversal of roles, gnawed relentlessly at their very souls, an unspoken but ever-present disquiet. At night, as the camp settled into a deceptive calm, they lay awake in their bunks, listening to the persistent chirping of crickets outside the barracks, their minds consumed by the bewildering implications of their new reality. What did it all truly mean? Not all of the women adjusted easily to this bewildering new paradigm. A few, their distrust deeply ingrained, actively resisted the perceived generosity, refusing to eat the unfamiliar food or hoarding precious bread crusts under their pillows, convinced that the apparent benevolence was merely a sinister trick, a prelude to some unforeseen cruelty. Whispers, like insidious tendrils of doubt, spread through the barracks. The food might be drugged. The soap might contain some hidden poison designed to incapacitate or harm them subtly. Yet day after day, week after week, nothing happened beyond the quiet, predictable routine of camp life. Their bodies, once gaunt and starved, slowly began to fatten, their cheeks filling out. Their skin, once sallow and blemished, gradually cleared. The pervasive lice, a constant irritation of their former lives, vanished entirely. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the deep-seated suspicion, a conditioned response to years of war and propaganda, began to yield to a reluctant, almost grudging acceptance. The Americans, too, observed their prisoners with a growing, if sometimes wary, curiosity. Many of the guards, having known German women only through the dehumanizing caricatures of wartime propaganda, were genuinely surprised by what they saw. Thin, exhausted individuals, often visibly frightened, and many barely older than their own sisters back home. One guard, in a letter penned home, articulated this nascent shift in perception. "They're not what we were told. They're just girls, and they look at us as if they're waiting for a blow that simply never comes." And so, the conflict between nations, once fought with guns and trenches, deepened into a more subtle, psychological battle of perception and deeply ingrained belief. The women found themselves compelled to reconcile the monstrous enemy they had been taught to imagine with the tangible human reality standing directly before them. Each unexpected bite of wholesome bread, each fragrant bar of soap, each neutral, almost kind word from a guard served as a small but potent crack in the carefully constructed image of hatred they had been forced to believe. The war, in its conventional sense, had ended, but within the private confines of their minds, another, more profound battle had just begun, a battle between ingrained memory and present reality, between the insidious lies of propaganda and the unsettling truth that now unfolded before their very eyes. Anna, in the intimate sanctuary of her diary, captured this internal conflict with painful, almost brutal clarity. To be treated with dignity by those we were explicitly told were beasts, it is harder than hatred. Hatred is easy. It provides a simple enemy, a clear target. Dignity, when bestowed by an enemy, is unbearable in its complexity. Her words, raw and honest, spoke for the silent turmoil raging within many of her fellow prisoners. They no longer feared being broken by the promised cruelty. Instead, they harbored a new, more profound fear,
that they would utterly be undone, stripped of their former identities by this bewildering, unexpected kindness. For some, this stark contrast began to manifest as a profound shame, a burden heavier and more oppressive than any physical chains. They were, after all, the enemy, soldiers of the defeated Reich. Yet here they were, inexplicably fed, clothed, and sheltered, their basic needs not only met, but generously exceeded. The Reich, the ideology they had been taught to pledge their absolute loyalty to, had demanded everything from them, sending them to man vital radios and operate crucial anti-aircraft searchlights, only to reward their devotion with gnawing hunger and the desolation of ruins. America, the very enemy they had been meticulously conditioned to hate with every fiber of their being, instead offered them simple, restorative soap and nourishing stew. This profound inversion of expectations, this bewildering reversal of roles, gnawed relentlessly at their very souls, an unspoken but ever-present disquiet. At night, as the camp settled into a deceptive calm, they lay awake in their bunks, listening to the persistent chirping of crickets outside the barracks, their minds consumed by the bewildering implications of their new reality. What did it all truly mean? Not all of the women adjusted easily to this bewildering new paradigm. A few, their distrust deeply ingrained, actively resisted the perceived generosity, refusing to eat the unfamiliar food or hoarding precious bread crusts under their pillows, convinced that the apparent benevolence was merely a sinister trick, a prelude to some unforeseen cruelty. Whispers, like insidious tendrils of doubt, spread through the barracks. The food might be drugged. The soap might contain some hidden poison designed to incapacitate or harm them subtly. Yet day after day, week after week, nothing happened beyond the quiet, predictable routine of camp life. Their bodies, once gaunt and starved, slowly began to fatten, their cheeks filling out. Their skin, once sallow and blemished, gradually cleared. The pervasive lice, a constant irritation of their former lives, vanished entirely. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the deep-seated suspicion, a conditioned response to years of war and propaganda, began to yield to a reluctant, almost grudging acceptance. The Americans, too, observed their prisoners with a growing, if sometimes wary, curiosity. Many of the guards, having known German women only through the dehumanizing caricatures of wartime propaganda, were genuinely surprised by what they saw. Thin, exhausted individuals, often visibly frightened, and many barely older than their own sisters back home. One guard, in a letter penned home, articulated this nascent shift in perception. "They're not what we were told. They're just girls, and they look at us as if they're waiting for a blow that simply never comes." And so, the conflict between nations, once fought with guns and trenches, deepened into a more subtle, psychological battle of perception and deeply ingrained belief. The women found themselves compelled to reconcile the monstrous enemy they had been taught to imagine with the tangible human reality standing directly before them. Each unexpected bite of wholesome bread, each fragrant bar of soap, each neutral, almost kind word from a guard served as a small but potent crack in the carefully constructed image of hatred they had been forced to believe. The war, in its conventional sense, had ended, but within the private confines of their minds, another, more profound battle had just begun, a battle between ingrained memory and present reality, between the insidious lies of propaganda and the unsettling truth that now unfolded before their very eyes. Anna, in the intimate sanctuary of her diary, captured this internal conflict with painful, almost brutal clarity. To be treated with dignity by those we were explicitly told were beasts, it is harder than hatred. Hatred is easy. It provides a simple enemy, a clear target. Dignity, when bestowed by an enemy, is unbearable in its complexity. Her words, raw and honest, spoke for the silent turmoil raging within many of her fellow prisoners. They no longer feared being broken by the promised cruelty. Instead, they harbored a new, more profound fear, that they would utterly be undone, stripped of their former identities by this bewildering, unexpected kindness.
One evening,
After a long day of strenuous work in the fields, the women were marched back to camp as the sun began its slow, majestic dip toward the horizon, painting the vast sky in hues of spilling gold. The sky above them was expansive, breathtakingly unmarred by the pervasive smoke and debris that had defined their European heavens. The air, crisp and cool, carried the clean, earthy scent of freshly cut grass. It was a simple, idyllic scene, one that in its profound tranquility weighed more heavily on their souls than the most vivid memories of their homeland's ruins. Here, stretched before them, was a land untouched, abundant, vibrantly alive. The once mighty Reich had collapsed into a desolate wasteland of rubble and despair. America, its triumphant enemy, stood utterly unscathed, flourishing. And in that stark, undeniable realization, a new, unsettling unease began to take root deep within their hearts. They had, against all odds, survived the initial shock of captivity, the unexpected soap, the hot showers, the abundant food. But something else was now dawning upon them, something far more difficult and complex to confront. For in the days that stretched ahead, it would not be their physical survival that posed the greatest challenge, but rather the slow, almost agonizing and deeply unsettling recognition that the enemy they had been taught to demonize might in fact be far more human and, ironically, far more powerful in its sheer capacity for a different kind of victory than they had ever dared to imagine. As the weeks inexorably settled into a predictable, almost monotonous rhythm, the women began, quite inadvertently, to lose their rigid grip on the passage of time. Their days were now defined by a recurring cycle: the insistent peal of the morning bell, the disciplined breakfast line, the physical demands of their work detail, the comforting routine of supper, and finally, the welcome command of lights out. Yet beneath this seemingly calm surface of routine, a strange and profound transformation had begun to stir, an imperceptible shifting of their inner landscapes. At first, they had meticulously counted the days, scratching tallies onto any available surface, like ancient prisoners marking their confinement in stone. But gradually, the sharp, agonizing edge of their captivity began to dull, replaced by a quiet, almost pervasive bewilderment. They were indeed captives, undeniably so, yet they were also consistently fed, adequately clothed, and even paid for their labor, a stark, almost absurd contrast to the promises of their collapsing Reich, where unwavering loyalty was ultimately rewarded with crushing hunger. This profound inversion of their world gnawed at their thoughts, more persistently and effectively than any physical barbed wire fence could ever hope to. Anna, who had once occupied a quiet office in Munich, her fingers flying across a typewriter, diligently transcribing orders she never dared to question, now found herself working in the bustling, often steamy camp laundry. The familiar scent of starch and clean soap, once a luxury, now clung to her fingers as she meticulously scrubbed and smoothed American uniforms. Each shirt, crisp and fresh, bore the unfamiliar initials of men who were, by all the rules of war, her sworn enemies. And yet, as she folded them neatly into orderly piles, she found herself feeling less hatred and more an odd, almost guilty sense of relief. Here, in this strange land, was work that did not directly involve the brutal machinery of war, work that, crucially, kept her alive. Sometimes she would catch a fleeting glimpse of her own reflection in the polished, gleaming steel of the washing drums, and she would find herself silently wondering who she was, slowly, inevitably becoming. Other women were dispatched into the sprawling fields surrounding the camp, working under the watchful but no longer overtly menacing eyes of their guards. Here they harvested crops that served to feed both the prisoners and the very soldiers who held them captive. They felt the warmth of the sun on their backs, the honest grittiness of dirt under their fingernails, and the surprisingly comforting, startling weight of full baskets brimming with produce. Some, in a moment of unguarded release, even laughed softly at their own sweat, finding in the simple physical labor a poignant, almost forgotten echo of the quiet village life they had left behind. In the evenings, they returned to the camp, their muscles aching with a satisfying fatigue, but their spirits, against all expectation, strangely lighter. This was unequivocally not the degradation, the brutal dehumanization they had so thoroughly prepared themselves for. This was something else entirely, something far more complex and disquieting.
The camp canteen, with its array of available goods, quickly became the most profoundly bewildering corner of their new world. With their small, precious wages, those slips of camp scrip, they could purchase items that had been unimaginable luxuries in their recent past: solid bars of chocolate, packets of cigarettes, sharp pencils for writing, and even jars of sweet, vibrant jam. The very first time Anna bit into a Hershey bar, the intense sweetness exploded on her tongue, a flavor of pure, unadulterated joy unlike anything she had tasted since the carefree days of her childhood. Tears, hot and unexpected, pricked at her eyes, and she quickly turned away from the others, ashamed of her own profound, almost illicit pleasure. A girl from Bremen, with a tentative, almost daring spirit, smeared a vivid line of lipstick on her lips, then stared at her transformed reflection in a small cracked mirror with a mixture of disbelief and dawning recognition. "I feel human again," she murmured, the words an almost sacrilegious confession. But this strange, almost overwhelming abundance carried its own unique torment. Letters from home continued to arrive, sometimes smuggled past the vigilant eyes of censors, their words etched with an almost unbearable desperation. Families wrote of their bombed-out apartments, now reduced to crumbling shells, of children racked the hacking coughs in damp, cold cellars, of endless bread lines stretching into the biting cold of winter. One woman, her voice choked with emotion, read aloud a plea from her own mother. "If only we had your American bread! Your brother starves!" Around her, a heavy, oppressive silence fell, broken only by the unsettling scratching of rats beneath the barracks floorboards. The women sat, clutching their precious, heartbreaking letters, their trays of abundant food now untouched, the shame of such plenty burning, a bitter, acidic taste in their throats. The American guards, too, began to notice this profound contradiction. Some were genuinely surprised, even a little taken aback, to observe the German women gaining weight in captivity, their gaunt cheeks filling out, their once dull hair regaining a healthy shine. "They're better fed than folks back home in some towns," one soldier muttered to a comrade, his tone a mixture of resentment for their own scarcity and genuine wonder at the mandated generosity. Yet, rules were rules. Under the strictures of the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were to be treated according to specific standards, standards that often, ironically, exceeded those endured by the civilian populations in war-torn Europe. The profound irony of this situation was certainly not lost on anyone involved. Still, the deep-seated suspicion, a survival mechanism honed by years of conflict, never fully vanished. At night, as darkness enveloped the camp, whispers, thin and persistent, crept through the bunks. What if this was all a carefully constructed facade? What if tomorrow the masks suddenly fell away and the real cruelty truly began? A handful of the women, their distrust an unyielding anchor,
clung fiercely to their skepticism, hoarding crusts of bread under their mattresses, convinced that the apparent abundance was merely an elaborate trap. Yet as weeks stretched into months, even the most cautious among them found themselves gradually worn down by the relentless, almost mundane normality of American order and routine. No brutal beatings came, no sadistic punishments beyond the dull, soul-numbing monotony of their daily work. The greatest cruelty, it seemed, was to be treated with such unexpected decency.
Anna's diary, a repository of her deepest thoughts, continued to record this internal conflict with painful, almost heartbreaking clarity. I eat, and my stomach thanks me with a strange, unfamiliar sense of satiation. I sleep, and my body, once skeletal, grows strong. Yet each kindness, each unexpected gesture of human decency, cuts me deeper than any blow. How do I reconcile this bewildering reality with the gaunt, hungry faces of children in Munich who drink only water for supper? Her words, raw and unvarnished, gave tangible shape to the invisible war now raging in the hearts of many of her fellow prisoners. To be brutalized, she mused, would have been simpler, easier to understand. To be afforded dignity by the very enemy, however, was an almost unbearable psychological burden. Amidst this profound turmoil, small, seemingly insignificant encounters with individual Americans only served to deepen the growing contradictions. One evening, during the ritualistic evening roll call, a young guard, perhaps distracted, accidentally dropped his flashlight. Anna, acting on instinct honed by years of military discipline, stooped immediately, picked it up, and returned it to him. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting instant, and for that brief moment their eyes met. He offered a quiet, almost imperceptible nod, nothing more, but the unexpected human connection lingered in her mind for days, an indelible imprint. Another time, a soldier, his stride purposeful as he passed by the laundry, hummed a tune, soft, rhythmic, and unmistakably American. A girl from Cologne, her face suddenly alight with recognition, identified the melody, laughed softly, and began to hum along. For a brief, transcendent second, two individuals, declared enemies by the brutal dictates of war, shared a song across a vast, artificial gulf that the conflict had proclaimed unbridgeable. It was important to note that not all the guards were friendly, or even neutral. Some looked at the women with undisguised disdain, their gazes sharp with the lingering grief for brothers, sons, or friends lost in the brutal campaigns of Europe. Yet even their hostility, simmering beneath the surface, rarely erupted into overt action. The women were undeniably not free, their lives circumscribed by barbed wire and military protocols. But neither were they brutally abused or tortured. They existed in a liminal, suspended state, a strange equilibrium between deserved punishment and unexpected reprieve. This ambiguous existence left them restless, profoundly uneasy, and utterly unable to anchor themselves in the comforting, albeit destructive, certainty of hatred. And then came the day, a pivotal moment that further shattered their preconceived notions when they were taken outside the camp's wire for work details in nearby American towns. The women rode in open trucks, rumbling through pristine American streets, their eyes wide with a profound, almost dizzying wonder. They gazed at shop windows overflowing with an unimaginable array of goods, children chasing hoops down sidewalks unmarred by craters, and men calmly reading newspapers on porches untouched by bombs. They inhaled the sweet, intoxicating aroma of bakeries, saw rows of gleaming cars parked in the sunlight, and stared at vibrant movie posters plastered on brick walls.
To women whose most recent memories of Germany were of cratered streets, smoldering ruins, and the constant threat of aerial bombardment, this vision of an untouched, flourishing nation was overwhelming.